Star Wars The Grey War, Chapter 4 by Nathan Brown. Grandmaster Liftling, said Kinsa with a nod, speaking into the small blue holograph of the leader of the Jedi Council. She was an older female Togruta, one of the most respected Ret Jedi in the Order. While Grandmaster Liftling was not a Twi'lek like Kinsa, she also had two heads, though instead of calling them Leku, Togrutas referred to them as Chunchin. The only difference was that instead of two Togrutas, including Grandmaster Liftling, had three. She also had two large, hollow, cone-shaped protrusions rising from her head. Though it couldn't be seen in the blue of the hologram, Grandmaster Liftling had a rusty red skin, though parts of her face around her eyes and her lips were so white it looked like paint. "It will be done," Kinsa promised the flickering blue image. "Report back to me when it is," she replied, in her stale voice dripping with disappointment and condescension. The hologram flickered out, and Kinsa was left alone in her ship. She let out a yell of exasperation and hung her head, full of frustration and shame. She had ignored the logic, and more importantly the rules of the Jedi Council, all because she thought she knew what was best. Now, because of her foolish, selfish actions, and a potentially dangerous man had escaped. Scene change. I'm feeling a little lazy, so the rest of this chapter is going to be automated.
Rogan sat in silence looking over the cool, barely registering heat signature of sleeping Barabels. These men, he thought, had families and lives. They were fighting to be free so they could return to their life. Rogan had no idea why he was fighting. He had to do it to survive, but, truthfully, part of him felt that it didn't even matter if he survived. If the only reason for drawing this breath was just to ensure he could draw a breath later, what was the point? Other species, when they first see Barabels, assume they are non- or semi-sentient because of their animal-like appearance. Rogan realized that he had been living like a non-sentient being ever since he had gone into exile, living off instinct, alone in the forest with no purpose but to keep breathing. He needed something more. Now that he was away from the forest and the danger, he saw it clearly. A man who lived for nothing bigger than himself was doing it uselessly. Other men had love, or they lived and died in war for the IR home or their convictions and beliefs. Rogan had none of this. He had no one he loved, no one who loved him. He no longer had a home and he held no convictions. Thinking on this, the female Jedi flashed into his mind. Kinsa had something bigger than herself to live for. It may absolutely repulse Rogan, but at least it was something. Rogan knew very little about the Jedi Order, but he knew they fought for what they thought was the good of the galaxy. He knew he could never be a Jedi. Something inside him clashed against something within them. The adult Barabels never talked about the Jedi except to say how wise and good they were. The children, however, were enthralled by stories of their martial strength and mystical ways, hoping that one day they too could perform such amazing feats. When one child of a tribe heard a kernel of a story, it was immediately spread throughout the rest of the children, each retelling of the story becoming more fantastic and further from the truth. He thought back again to the story he heard as a child of a Brotherhood of Darkness, people who had knowledge of the Force and fought against the Jedi. They had all been killed in a great war on a distant planet. According to the stories he'd heard, they had been victims of a great explosion of the Force. It had been released by the Jedi to wipe them out once and for all. Despite the stories, he couldn't imagine that all of them had perished in the mystical explosion. Perhaps there were a few left. He knew without a doubt there had to be others like him. People who had the Force but had either not been found or had denied the Jedi. Living among non-Force users his entire life, he had never thought of people who were stronger than him. Now though, after losing to the Jedi, he realized there must be people out there who were more powerful than himself. He thought if he could meet them he could grow and maybe do something useful with his life. The blossoming thought was crushed when he realized that any people like him, People who had avoided the grasp of the Jedi would also have little to no understanding of the Force. How, he wondered, did the first Force users learn to be as strong as the Jedi are, or as the Brotherhood of Darkness? They couldn't have had anyone to train them because they were the first. In a flash of inspiration, he suddenly knew what he would do when he was free. He would restart again the Brotherhoods of Darkness. He would seek out and find other people like him, like-minded people with Force abilities. Together they could scour the galaxy for knowledge about the Force. They would experiment and practice, writing down what worked and what didn't for future generations. After Rajan's death, they would continue growing in knowledge and size until they could once again rival the Jedi as their predecessors had. Perhaps, he thought, such a group already existed. If he wasn't the only non-Jedi Force user, there could be others who'd had this idea before him. Whether he ended up starting it or just joining an already existing army, he would be serving for a greater goal. He didn't think challenging the Jedi could happen in his lifetime, but that was perfect. This idea was bigger and more important than himself. He felt a warm feeling of contentment spread inside him as he finally let himself drift off to sleep. He knew now why he drew breath. Scene change. The door opened with a mechanical hiss and warm air entered the cockpit, mixing with and quickly overpowering the cold, stale air of her ship. The ship vibrated softly as the ramp of her ship extended out and connected with the dock. Cognews breathed deeply, letting the familiar smells fill her and bring her to the past for a moment. She reminisced about her past life as she walked down the steps onto the dock. All spaceports smelled the same. Even though she hadn't taken her sleek, customized ship, she still drew the attention of the vendors around the docks. She'd hardly pad off the metal docks onto the reddish-brown dirt before she was being called to by the many merchants, holding their wares high for her to see. She quickly flipped up the hood on her simple black cloak and used the Force to make herself less noticeable. It didn't truly make her less visible. That was a different ability that required much more attention. All this did was make people ignore her. She was still there, but people did not perceive her unless they were looking for her. With 2 more steps, the calls from the merchants had ceased and she blended into a throng of people. She knew from experience that the gladiator pits would be close to the port in an attempt to attract the bets of smugglers and shippers just staying long enough for their cargo to be loaded into their ships by the many rusted droids whizzing about the spaceport or the few organic workers grunting and sweating, trying to keep up. She walked quickly, following what seemed to be the largest stream of people, keeping her eyes out for the amphitheater. She preferred not to talk to others if it could be helped. Scene change. Rogan awoke, jerking him from his nightmare. Barabels were not supposed to ever dream, but he did. He always had. He used to tell his friends and family about his dreams, but they called him a liar enough times that he learned to keep them to himself. Even as a child, his dreams had been bad, full of sadness and evil, and they had only gotten worse with age. He looked around the room, seeing the heat seeping in through the windows. He switched to normal sight to see the light filtering through them. He tried to guess the time, but he truly had no idea. He wasn't used to being awake when it was light out, and he didn't know the sun cycle of this planet. Seeing that nothing was going to happen soon, he tried to get back to sleep, figuring he would need his rest for the fights. However, for some reason, he could not do so. Something was keeping him awake. Suddenly, the door swung open slowly, clearly by someone trying not to make noise. The man walked in and Rogan somehow knew that it was the slaver he had knocked unconscious. Rogan kept his head back down and looked at the other side of the small room, waiting to see what would happen next. He closed his eyes and practiced an ability he developed only a few years ago. With his eyes squeezed shut and his infrared vision off, he tried to focus on what was going on around him. As he opened up his awareness, he could feel the man walking towards him. He couldn't actually see the man moving to him, but he could tell he was coming. He felt the man raising his leg up, preparing to slam it into Rajan's face. Before the kick landed, Rogan reached up and grabbed the man's foot. He opened his eyes and twisted the man's foot to the right, forcing him off balance. As the man fell, Rogan jumped to his feet. The other Barabels started waking up from the noise. The slaver sprang up, red-faced and sputtering. "Slave, I should kill you for even daring to touch me. The only reason I won't is so I can make a heap or make money off your death. I'ma be laughing when I see you lying dead and broken in the pit as I count all my credits." The man looked even worse from the front. His splotchy, wrinkled skin hung in bags off his skull, pooling into folds. It truly seemed like this man had too much skin for his body, as if he used to be a much larger man but had lost a significant amount of fat, muscle and somehow on bone recently. His teeth, set in black gums, were stained yellow, but Rogan was surprised to see they were all still there. Rogan knew very little about how humans were supposed to look, but he knew that no species was supposed to be in this condition. "We shall see," said Rogan matter-of-factly. "So, when do I fight? I'm looking forward to disappointing you. If you're so excited, you can be first," came a voice from the doorway. Rogan turned to see three men he hadn't met before standing in the doorway. The one who spoke was a short, dark-skinned human flanked by two other humans of similar color. One was taller and fatter, the other looked to Rogan identical to the first man. "We're the Balu brothers," the man said, walking towards him with an outstretched hand. "Our family owns the gladiatorial operation on this planet, and it's our job to escort you lot to your fights." He turned to face the slowly waking crowd and gestured to the scrawny slaver. "This man here volunteered to help." The larger man stepped forward. "As you heard, your friend here has already volunteered to go first, but for the rest of you, here's how it works. I already have your names from the ship's log and you'll be fighting in alphabetical order. You'll be fighting men from other planets in similar situations to yourselves. If you make it far enough, you will have to fight one of your own. Once your name is called, you will enter the pit assigned to you and fight to the death. There are no rounds or timeouts. Once the fight is done, you have 5 minutes to rest before your next challenger is brought in. If you survive 5 fights, then you'll be free to return home or receive a one-way ticket to any planet in the local system. Any questions?" Looking around the room, Rogan could tell that lots of the Barabels had questions but were too nervous to ask. "Perfect." All three of the men turned and walked quickly out the door, and the Barabels scrambled to follow with Rogan moving in behind them. The slaver walked behind him with a smug smile painted on his face. They got out the door and the shining sun assaulted Rajan's eyes. He stumbled in a rush to hide his head from the sun. The slaver laughed and shoved him forward, causing him to bump into what he assumed was another Barabel. Even with his eyes closed, the burning light seeped painfully into his unaccustomed eyes. He heard the slaver's cruel laughs behind him and he refused to give the man any satisfaction. With his eyes shut, he looked around and, finding where it seemed brightest, and opened his eyes wide. The light pierced through his eyes and it felt like they were being melted away, but he kept on staring, forcing his nocturnal eyes to adjust to the light. Streams of unintentional tears leaked from his burning eyes, but he refused to look away from the terrible red sun. He knew he would need his full vision in the fight. He continued staring at the sun until his vision began returning. His sight was still fuzzy and everything felt overexposed. He saw the other Barabels struggling with the light. They were covering their eyes with their hands and bumping into each other as they stumbled forward. Rogan pushed them to the side and walked to the front just behind the three men, who had not slowed down. The short one who had spoken first looked back with a cruel smile, but, seeing Rogan walking in stride with them, the look on his face became one of mild surprise. Rogan continued walking for a few minutes, the other Barabels eventually recovering and catching up. Soon he heard yelling and cheering, and they came upon the gladiatorial arena. They stood at the top of a long, narrow stairway leading to a flat floor with a dozen large, man-made holes. The stairway was a part of a large circular, roofless coliseum. Benches packed with people were set up in rows all along the sloping walls of the arena. Many of the beings were species Rogan didn't recognize. Most were holding some kind of binoculars so they could see the long way down to the floor where the fighting would take place. As they walked down, the people to their right and left yelled in their faces, cheering them on or trying to frighten them. Rogan couldn't tell. The whole arena was so large that Rogan couldn't see the crowd on the other side. All he could see was a mix of shapes and colors. Rogan turned to the sandy floor to see what the crowd was so excited about and could just make out two figures fighting in on each of the many pits. The large barbells were forced to walk single file down the stairway. Rogan continued looking around the arena and saw that there were 4 other stairways like this one in the arena. To the stairway to his left he could see a group of people walking down the stairway. When they got to the bottom, they were told to sit on a long worn bench. They all sat in silence with the cheering of the crowd and the comment of the announcers washing over them. Suddenly, the already noisy crowd exploded with groans of disappointment and cheers of elation. Apparently, that fight had ended. Eventually the crowd calmed down and the voice came blasting through speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen of all species, you are in for a treat today. We have 4 of the best fighters in the galaxy for your pleasure. Wookiees, strong and ferocious with long, muscular limbs. Barbells, each one over 2 meters tall, covered in thick scales, and watch out for that tail. Zabraks, quick and strong, almost as dangerous without a weapon as with one. Last, but definitely not least, Wampas, the gigantic semi-sentient snow beasts from the unforgiving ice planet Hoth. They fight with ferocious instinct, using no weapon besides their own bodies." "You're up, kid," said the tall dark-skinned man slapping him on the shoulder. "Good luck, give 'em a show. And make me some money," whispered the slaver as Rogan walked by. "Okay everybody," the theatrical voice continued, coming from all directions at once. "For your enjoyment, we have 2 groups of fighters at once, so if one slows down feel free to watch another. Your first fighters will be in the dangerous spike pit, lined on all sides with 2-foot-long, razor-sharp spikes carved from the bones of a rancor. Your other opponents will be fighting in the never-ending pit, sporting the large hole in the middle that reaches down to the middle of the planet. In the spike pit, we have one of the ferocious jungle warriors from Kashyyyk against an armored giant from the dark planet Barab-1. In the never-ending pit, we have the frozen monsters of the ice planet Hoth against the vicious, tattooed warriors from the harsh planet Iridonia. 2 large spotlights shone on 2 of the pits, both about 12 meters across and 3 meters deep. Another spotlight shone on a gigantic weapons rack in the middle of the arena. Combatants, choose your weapons." The crowd cheered wildly as the 4 men walked towards the middle of the arena. As he neared the weapons, Rogan saw a large hairy man he assumed was a Wookiee. He had never seen one before, but he knew what a Zabrak looked like, so he knew this shaggy man must be his opponent. They reached the rack at the same time. Rogan turned to the other man. He was amazed at the staggering mass of the man in front of him. He was easily as tall as Rogan, and with his thick, shaggy hair he seemed to be even taller. The monstrous man turned and stared at him, eye to eye, something Rogan was used to. Rogan nodded his head at him. "Good luck," he blurted out, not knowing what to say to this man he was about to fight. In response, the Wookiee simply grunted and yanked a giant war hammer from the rack. Rogan scoffed and looked over the large array of weapons. He chose a large broadsword with a wide blade. He pulled it off the rack and swung it around, feeling the weight. He could tell that it wasn't very well made. It felt like it had been shoved and poorly welded together rather than made as one sturdy piece. Despite this, he could see the edge was brilliantly sharp, something Rogan imagined was of utmost importance to the organizers of these fights. The sword was a little bit lighter than his old blade, but it would do fine. Having chosen his weapon, he turned from the weapons rack towards the pit where he would be fighting. He saw the Wookiee stepping onto a platform that would lower him into the pit. Rogan got a running start and launched himself into the pit, flying past the spikes and landing in the sand with a quick roll. The Wookiee looked down from the lowering platform and growled. He stood at the edge of the platform and jumped the last meter into the pit about a foot from Rogan. They stared at each other almost eye to eye for a few moments before walking backwards to their respective sides of the pit. Whoa, 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 would you look at the hostility? This one is sure to be a ferocious fight. Looks like the combatants are ready, but are you ready? He questioned the crowd. The stands erupted into a screaming frenzy. Rogan found it strange that so many people would watch two people fighting, and that they were getting this worked up about it. Fight. Rogan blocked out the screaming of the crowd and the announcer's blaring voice, focusing fully on the Wookiee. The woolly man swung his hammer in a show of strength, back and forth, finishing by smashing it to the ground, sending tremors through the hard-packed sand. Seeing a man's clear arrogance, Rogan smirked and motioned with his hand for the man to come. Turning his back on him, he lowered his sword and let it rest on the sand. He reached out of himself and felt the confused hesitation from the man turn to insulted rage. He could practically see the man start running towards him, holding his hammer high, posed to strike. Even if he didn't have the force, the massive, bounding steps of the Wookiee let Rogan know where he was. When Rogan sensed the man was about 4 meters away, he spun, dragging the tip of his sword along the dirt. As he spun, the sword gained momentum, which he used to raise his sword up and before releasing it underhand. It flew up, flipping end over end. It reached the sprinting man, slicing into his stomach and embedding into his chest. A look of shock came over the man's furry face, and he immediately dropped his warhammer. He stopped running, but his momentum continued to propel him forward towards Rogan. Before he crashed into him, Rogan stepped to the side and let the man move past him and fall to the floor, sending up a cloud of sand as he landed with a thud. Rogan placed his foot on the man's shoulder and rolled the man onto his back. He crouched down and grabbed the hilt of his sword. "Bad luck," he whispered to the dead man with a sharp hiss. He yanked his blade out of his chest and cleaned the blood off. Rogan looked around at the crowd and sat down, waiting for his next challenger. Scene change. Cognews smiled beneath her cowl. She had felt the gladiator when he had used the Force to determine the Wookiee's location. She also admired his dangerous approach to the fight. Cognews knew it would be 4 more fights until the man gained his freedom. She was extremely interested in watching the rest of them.